What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
I was 26, had just been laid off from a nonprofit job I actually cared about. My savings were running thin, and the lease on my apartment had run out with no plans to renew because I thought, foolishly, that a couple of months back at my mom's house would give me enough time to regroup, find something new, and maybe just breathe for a bit. It wasn't supposed to be a long-term thing. It wasn't even supposed to be comfortable, just temporary. What I didn't realize when I walked through that front door with my one suitcase and a laptop under my arm was that I was walking into a trap that had been quietly set long before I ever arrived. It started like this, she said, totally offhand during dinner one night, that she was taking in a foster kid for a few weeks. Said the system was overrun and they needed short-term placements. I didn't think much of it. My mom, Linda, had always had a way of making everything she did sound noble. She didn't say it with pride exactly, more like martyrdom, like the whole world was a burden only she had the spine to carry. I nodded, offered some vague encouragement, and went back to cleaning up dishes while she sat and drank wine like she always did after dinner. By the end of that week, it wasn't one kid. It was 3, all under the age of 8. She barely introduced them to me. Just told me she had some errands to run and left me alone with them for almost 6 hours. I didn't even know their names yet. I tried to ask questions. How long would they be staying? Who is their caseworker? Do they have any medical needs? And she just waved me off and said I was overthinking it and that I should relax because it's good practice. Good practice for what? I asked, and she looked at me like I was an idiot and said, for life. For when you finally grow up and start your own family. A week later, there were 6 of them. 6. And no, I'm not exaggerating. 6 small, traumatized, confused, loud, emotional little kids were suddenly in our home, and she was barely around. She kept saying it was temporary, that they'd only be here for a couple of days or maybe a week at most. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and eventually, it wasn't even a discussion anymore, it was just expected. I'd wake up, and she'd already be gone. I'd make their breakfast, get them dressed, call schools, coordinate meds, try to calm down the tantrums, try to understand why the youngest kept wetting the bed or why the oldest refused to eat anything that wasn't from a can. I was doing therapy-level parenting without a single hour of training, and meanwhile, Linda would stroll back in around 8 or 9 at night like she'd had a full day of office work and was just too exhausted to deal with anything. I tried to talk to her more than once. I'd pull her aside and tell her I was struggling, that I needed help, that I couldn't do this alone. She'd always laugh it off. Once, she even said, "Oh please, you're finally doing something useful instead of sitting on your ass all day." She acted like I owed her this, like the very fact that I was living in her house gave her the right to use me however she wanted. And when I finally told her I was exhausted, and I mean I actually used that word, looking her dead in the eye, almost begging for her to hear me, she didn't show even a flicker of sympathy. She just snorted, took another sip of her wine, and said, "Be grateful we didn't drop them at a shelter." That sentence is what changed everything. Not just because of how casually cruel it was, although that would have been enough, but because I saw, maybe for the first time in my life, who she really was. She didn't care about those kids. She wasn't doing this out of compassion. She was doing it for the monthly checks, for the tax breaks, for the praise she got at church when she played the saint. And me? I was just free labor. I was the convenient daughter who happened to be jobless and vulnerable and living in her spare room, so she used me like a babysitter she didn't have to pay. And when I cracked under the pressure, she called it weakness. I didn't say anything that night. I just nodded, walked upstairs, and shut the door. But that was the moment something shifted in me. I stopped complaining. I stopped asking for help. I stopped hoping she'd change. And instead, I started watching. Not just her, everything. I watched how the kids reacted when she came into the room, how they flinched when she raised her voice, how one of them called me Mom by accident and then immediately apologized like she thought she'd done something wrong. I watched how Linda locked up the pantry at night so they wouldn't sneak food, how she complained about the youngest being difficult to her friends while completely ignoring the fact that the girl had night terrors almost every night. I watched her fake reports to the agency, coach the kids to smile, and say everything was fine when the social worker came by for 5 rushed minutes every other month. I watched the money she received, and trust me, there was money get spent on wine, nails, and new clothes for her, not for the kids. And I started taking notes. There's a kind of silence that happens when you've been dismissed too many times. It's not peace. It's not defeat either. It's something more dangerous. It's strategy. I realized no one was coming to save those kids or me. So I'd have to find a way to save all of us. And I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to fight. I was going to wait. Watch. Document. And when the time came, I would hit her where it would hurt most, her pride, her money, and her illusion of control. You ever had someone try to make you feel like you're crazy for wanting basic respect? Or tell you that you're lucky they didn't do something worse, as if that somehow made their behavior okay? Let me know in the comments, because I swear, when she laughed in my face that night and said I should be grateful, something inside me snapped into place. Not broke, just locked in. She thought I was weak. She was about to find out how wrong she was. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion, though that came in heavy waves, the kind that made my hands shake in the middle of making lunch for 6 kids who all wanted something different. Or in the middle of the night when I'd be cleaning up another accident while Linda snored 2 doors down like the weight of this house didn't even touch her. No, the hardest part was the silence, the kind that sinks into your bones when you realize no one, not one single person, is coming to help you, and the people who should care either don't believe you or don't want to hear it because the truth is too uncomfortable to deal with. It had been about 2.5 months when I realized that not only was I doing everything, and I mean everything, from the school drop-offs to packing lunches to handling meltdowns to calling therapists to explaining to a 7-year-old why their biological mom wouldn't be visiting, but that my mother had stopped pretending to do anything at all, which meant she wasn't even bothering with the act anymore. Not with the kids, not with the caseworker, and definitely not with me. And at that point I think she assumed I'd accepted it, that I'd accepted this new life where my needs didn't matter and the kids were her ticket to appearing generous, while someone else quietly held the entire thing together in the background without acknowledgement or support. There was this one day, the kind you don't forget, not because something big happened, but because nothing changed, and the lack of change was its own kind of horror. I had been up all night with 2 of the younger ones who had fevers, and by the time morning came, I had barely slept for maybe 30 minutes in total, and I remember dragging myself to the kitchen to start breakfast, trying to ignore the pounding in my skull and the way my body was shaking from sheer depletion, and as I was pouring cereal into plastic bowls, my mother came in, fully rested, nails freshly done, holding her damn tablet and scrolling through whatever fake friend drama she pretended to care about, and instead of asking how the night went or offering to help, she looked at me, wrinkled her nose, and asked why the dishes weren't done. I stood there, holding a box of Cheerios with one hand and a wet spoon in the other, and I realized that I could explain myself. I could list all the things I had done that night. I could talk about the vomiting, the cries, the damp bed sheets, the medicine schedules, the way I had to hold the youngest in my arms until they calmed down enough to breathe. But it wouldn't matter, because she didn't see me, not really, not as a human being with limits, but as a tool, a body that made her life easier, and the fact that I was drowning didn't concern her so long as I kept paddling just hard enough not to sink. That same week, I started keeping a notebook, not because I had a plan yet, not because I knew what I'd do with it, but because I needed to keep track of what was happening, both for my own sanity and because something in me whispered that eventually this would matter: the dates, the conversations, the doctor appointments she skipped, the receipts for the state reimbursements she used on herself, the moments the kids cried after she left them behind for another emergency hair appointment, the times she lied about their behavior just to get out of attending a school meeting or therapy session. It was in that process, writing everything down, logging every absurd moment, that I started noticing patterns, especially around money, because while my mother liked to pretend she was doing the Lord's work by fostering these children, she was meticulous about filing her paperwork on time for those monthly checks, and one day, While she was out, I went into her home office, if you could call it that, and looked at the file folder she thought she had hidden, and there it was, clear as day. Monthly deposits for each child, additional funds for special needs, transportation stipends, clothing vouchers, all of it in her name, all of it going directly into an account she used for her own expenses, and the realization hit me like a freight train. She wasn't doing this out of kindness. She was running a business, and I was the unpaid employee keeping the whole thing afloat while she cashed in and played saint to anyone who would listen. I think the breaking point for me, not emotionally, but strategically, came when one of the kids, the middle one, looked up at me after I had settled them into bed and asked, "Are you our mom now?" And I didn't know how to answer, because the truth was, I wasn't their mom, but I was the one who stayed, the one who fed them, comforted them, protected them, and taught them how to trust again in small, careful ways, and when I hesitated, they looked scared, like they'd said something wrong, like they'd overstepped, and I realized that even they, in their little hearts, knew that affection was conditional in this house, and it broke something in me, something I didn't even know could still be broken. I didn't correct them. I didn't tell them I wasn't their mom. I just said, "You're safe here, and I'll always take care of you," and they smiled and closed their eyes like that was enough, like the idea that someone would stay, even if they weren't related, was more comforting than any title. And in that moment I understood that whatever came next, I couldn't abandon them, not like everyone else had, but I also couldn't keep playing this role without taking back some control, because if I didn't, she would burn me out and replace me the second I collapsed, just like she always had with everything in her life. That night, after they all fell asleep, I sat at the dining table with a cup of cold coffee and opened my laptop, and instead of browsing jobs or apartments or sending out resumes like I used to, I started reading through the foster care guidelines, state reimbursement policies, legal guardianship rules, and child welfare protocols, and every page I read was like opening a door I didn't know existed, a door she had locked shut for years with guilt and control and manipulation, but now I had the key. It wasn't about revenge yet. It wasn't even about justice. It was about survival. And if I had to play the long game to save myself and those kids from the toxic cycle we were trapped in, then that's exactly what I was going to do, because there was no help, no pay, and no escape, not unless I built one from scratch. And trust me, I would. There's something that happens when you've been carrying more than you were ever meant to hold for longer than anyone should be expected to. You stop feeling things in the way you used to. Not because you've gone numb exactly, but because your body, your mind, even your emotions, start prioritizing survival over sensation, and somewhere along the way, I stopped reacting to the chaos in that house the way a normal person would, because if I had let myself feel the full weight of it every single day, the screaming, the crying, the fear, the mess, the constant, bone-deep responsibility, I would have cracked open like a dropped plate on tile, and there would have been no putting me back together. At that point, I was managing everything like a system: morning routines, food prep, diaper changes, school drop-offs, therapy sessions, medication schedules, calming strategies for meltdowns, and bedtimes that never stuck, all of it on autopilot. And all of it fueled by sheer will, not love, not joy, and certainly not thanks. And meanwhile, my mother, Linda, had shifted into a full-blown performance mode anytime someone from the outside showed up, turning on this artificial charm she'd perfected over the years, smiling sweetly while she parroted talking points about trauma-informed care and being a healing space, when in reality she hadn't spoken to most of the kids for more than 5 minutes a day in months and couldn't even tell you their teachers' names, let alone what kind of support they actually needed. But she knew how to cash the checks, and that was the part she never messed up. What started as vague suspicion hardened into certainty the more I studied her routines and reviewed the paperwork. She thought I wasn't smart enough to understand. I would wait until she left for one of her bi-weekly volunteer brunches, which, let's be honest, were usually mimosas with the church ladies who liked to pretend they were still in their 30s. And I'd go into her office and pull the folder she kept tucked behind the bookshelf. Inside were copies of the reimbursement forms, state aid breakdowns, and personal bank statements that she either didn't realize I'd know how to read or simply thought I was too overwhelmed to care about, and that's where I found the real numbers. Each child had a file, and each file had notes, not about their well-being or their progress or even their struggles, but about what their value was from a financial standpoint, as if they were inventory in a warehouse. She had actual notes next to each child's name, things like gets extra food allowance, meds equals supplemental funding, and easy placement, high payout. I stared at those notes for longer than I should have, not because I was shocked exactly. I think, deep down, I had already known, but because seeing it written out so casually in her handwriting made it real in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. These weren't children to her. They were income streams. And yet, the money never made it to the kids in any meaningful way. The clothes they wore were hand-me-downs from donation bins, the food they ate was cheap bulk items from discount stores, and when one of them needed new shoes because the soles had split open, she told me to figure it out because the check isn't until next week, even though I'd seen the deposit hit her account just days earlier. I used my own debit card to buy the shoes, and that night I sat on the floor of my room and stared at my near-empty bank account and wondered, not for the first time, how the hell I had let it get this far. But I didn't stop. Instead, I got smarter. I started scanning copies of everything, the reports, the bank slips, the caseworker evaluations, the medical records, even the daily schedules I was forced to keep just to stay afloat. And I compiled it all in a digital file on a flash drive I kept in the lining of my purse, along with printed copies I stored in a Ziploc bag under the bottom drawer of my dresser. I wasn't just preparing for a confrontation anymore. I was preparing for war, the kind of war where the truth mattered more than emotions, and documentation was the only weapon I could count on. What I didn't expect, or maybe I just hadn't prepared for, was how deeply the kids would start to depend on me in ways I couldn't retreat from, even if I'd wanted to. It started with little things, like one of the boys asking me to read to him at night because your voice doesn't scare me, or the oldest girl, who hadn't spoken much to anyone for weeks, suddenly whispering that she had a nightmare and didn't want to be alone. These were small moments, but they carved into me like soft blades, reminding me that they weren't just paperwork or victims of a broken system. They were real, scared, resilient little people who had already been passed around too many times and didn't know who, if anyone, they could trust. One afternoon, while I was brushing one of their hair in the living room, Linda walked in and made a joke to a friend on the phone about me being the live-in nanny who forgot to negotiate a salary, and something about the way she said it, the pride in her voice, the dismissal in her laugh, made me see her for what she really was, not a misled woman or a stressed-out parent, but someone who thrived on control and would do anything to maintain the image she had built, even if it meant stepping on the very people who kept that image standing. And that's when the plan began to take shape. Not just to escape, because at this point, escape wasn't enough, but to take something back, something real, something permanent. I started researching guardianship laws in our state, reading through the forms, watching court hearings online, joining anonymous forums where other people shared stories that looked terrifyingly like mine. I learned about the legal loopholes, the burden of proof, the exact kind of documentation that made a judge listen, and I kept collecting, filing, waiting. Because every check had a name. And every name had a story. And every story, if told properly, with enough care and truth in detail, had the power to tear down even the most polished lies. My mother thought she had control because she held the purse strings, but what she didn't realize was that I held something stronger: evidence, motive, and the unwavering trust of 6 children who were slowly starting to see who really showed up when it counted. She thought the checks made her powerful. But I had the names. And soon, I'd make sure the court knew every single one. There is a point, somewhere between tolerance and collapse, where a person no longer reacts with panic, not because the situation has improved, and not because it has grown any less unbearable, but because the mind has shifted entirely into a new mode. One that doesn't rely on hope or external rescue, one that sees every moment as either an opportunity to survive or a chance to dismantle the thing that's keeping you trapped. And by the time the state finally knocked on our door unannounced, I was no longer scared of what might happen if my mother found out what I had been doing behind her back. I was ready for it. It began on a Tuesday morning, around 10, when the kids were scattered in their usual chaotic rhythms of late breakfast, coloring, and mild sibling arguments, and I was halfway through sorting a week's worth of clean laundry on the dining room table. Still in the oversized t-shirt I had slept in and barely caffeinated, when the doorbell rang with a kind of urgency that made the youngest jump and spill their cereal. At first, I thought it might be the mail carrier needing a signature or a neighbor coming to complain about the noise again, but when I opened the door and saw two representatives from Child Protective Services standing there, one with a clipboard and the other with a quiet, professional expression that could either mean sympathy or suspicion, I knew immediately that something had shifted, and not in a small way. They asked to come in, and I nodded, my throat dry, my palms suddenly sweaty, not from guilt, because I had nothing to be ashamed of, but from the sudden realization that this was it, the beginning of whatever came next, and no matter how calm I stayed, no matter how prepared I felt, there was no way to predict how it would all unfold. I led them inside, told the kids to keep playing, and offered the workers coffee out of reflex more than manners, and they politely declined as they began their routine, asking names, relationships, care schedules, and health histories. But this time, unlike the previous surface-level visits we had endured where Linda sat in the room and dominated every answer, these two weren't interested in talking to my mother at all. They wanted to talk to me. They had received a report, they said, from a source that would remain anonymous, though I had my suspicions about who it might have been, perhaps a teacher or a nurse. Or maybe even the school counselor I had begun confiding in during pickup hours when the oldest started showing signs of anxiety and stress that I could no longer mask with basic parenting strategies. Whatever the case, the report had triggered a flag, which led to a file review, and that file review, once compared to recent medical records, school attendance patterns, and the documentation I had begun quietly supplying under the radar, had raised more than a few eyebrows. They asked about living arrangements, daily schedules, division of responsibility, and financial distributions, and I answered calmly, steadily, with the kind of careful honesty that comes from being both deeply exhausted and deeply certain that you're telling the truth. I didn't dramatize anything, didn't throw my mother under the bus directly, because I didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves, and I knew that the more measured I sounded, the more clearly the contrast would show between me and the woman they would eventually confront. They spoke with the children next, one by one, quietly and respectfully, while I busied myself in the kitchen pretending not to listen, but my ears caught every phrase, the hesitation in their voices, the pauses, the soft words like, "Sometimes she yells a lot," or "I don't like it when she leaves us alone," or "Aaron helps us, not her," and I could feel the truth landing in slow, steady waves across the caseworker's notepad. They didn't ask to see Linda. They didn't ask where she was. They already knew enough to know that her presence wouldn't clarify anything. By the time they left, they informed me that a temporary 72-hour restriction was being placed on my mother's contact with the children, effective immediately, and that a formal inquiry into her foster license and financial practices was underway. I nodded, my heart pounding in a strange mix of relief and dread, and they handed me a document, an official notice, that I tucked into the back of the kitchen drawer beneath the rubber bands and unopened batteries, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I needed it close. When Linda returned later that night and saw the kids weren't waiting at the door to greet her the way they used to, because by then they had started keeping their distance from her without even realizing it, she sensed something was off, and when I told her, calmly and without expression, that CPS had come by and issued a temporary contact suspension, she stared at me like I had slapped her, then laughed in that brittle, forced way that people do when they know they've lost control but haven't yet figured out how to spin the narrative. She accused me of betrayal, of conspiring against her, of poisoning the kids with lies, and when none of that worked, she went for guilt, asking how I could do this to her after all she had sacrificed. after all the work she had done to keep a roof over our heads and care for those poor children. But the thing was, I didn't feel guilt anymore. I didn't feel fear either. I had lived under the weight of her self-serving version of motherhood for too long, and the only thing I felt now was clarity, because I wasn't the one who had failed those kids. She was. And now, finally, someone else was starting to see it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while she was busy crafting her next lie, I had already taken the next step. That same week, I filed my preliminary application for legal guardianship of all 6 children, backed by every document I had spent the last few months collecting, every letter from their teachers, every note from the pediatrician, every attendance log and therapy update and medical expense I had covered out of my own account. I didn't know if it would work, didn't know how the court would see me, a single woman with no formal training, barely scraping by, but I knew this much. I was the only adult in their lives who had actually shown up, day after day, without agenda, without paycheck, without reward. I spoke to a family attorney the following day, a woman named Carol who had once worked in the foster system herself and now specialized in complex guardianship cases. She read through my file silently for a long time, then looked up and said, "You've got a strong case, stronger than I've seen in years," and I remember nodding, not in pride, but in grim recognition of just how much I had endured to get to this moment. Linda tried, in the days that followed, to manipulate the situation back into her control, calling mutual acquaintances to smear me, posting vague, sanctimonious messages online about ungrateful children and selfish people, and even attempting to confront one of the social workers during a school pickup, which only strengthened the report against her. Each time she tried to claw her way back, she dug the hole deeper, and each time, I kept my head down and kept building my case. Because this wasn't just about proving that she was unfit. This was about proving that I was ready. And that, no matter what story she tried to spin, the truth was already out, and there was no version of it where she came out looking like the savior she had always pretended to be. There are moments in life when you realize that no matter how long the road has been, no matter how much you've been forced to endure, and no matter how many times you've been made to question your own sanity, your own worth, or your own capacity to carry weight that was never meant to be yours, there comes a day, if you are patient, deliberate, and just ruthless enough to outlast the people who underestimated you, when the scales finally tip and the truth, no matter how carefully buried, starts to rise on its own, slow and undeniable, until the entire structure built on lies begins to crumble, not in some explosive burst, but in quiet, steady collapse, exactly the way my mother's world did the morning we walked into that courthouse. By then, I was no longer surviving, I was prepared. I had learned to separate myself from her manipulations, her dramatic guilt trips, and her constant, thinly veiled threats about what would happen if I pushed too far, because what she never understood, and what she still, somehow, refused to believe, was that I had stopped being the scared, aimless daughter she once controlled the moment I chose to protect those children, not out of obligation, not because of blood or fear or misplaced guilt, but because it was the only way to make sure someone did the right thing when everyone else had failed them. The courthouse wasn't grand, wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of place you imagine when you think of justice being served. It was a dull beige building with bad lighting and stale air. But to me, it felt like the finish line of a race I never meant to enter and refused to lose. We arrived early, myself and the kids, who had now begun to form their own routines and expectations with me, their trust built slowly through months of consistency and presence and quiet reassurance. They were dressed in simple clothes we had picked together, each one holding a small item, a toy, a book, a drawing, as if bringing a piece of their lives into that building would remind them who they were, no matter what the adults decided. Linda arrived last, of course, making her usual entrance as though the entire proceeding was beneath her, hair done, makeup heavy, clothes too formal for the setting, dragging behind her a lawyer she had hired only 2 days prior. A man who clearly hadn't had enough time to read the entire file and kept flipping through notes with the frustration of someone realizing too late that the story he'd been sold wasn't holding up under scrutiny. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the kids. She simply scanned the room with that expression she always wore when she felt cornered, tight-lipped, cold, eyes darting as if trying to find a camera, a witness, someone she could still impress or manipulate. The hearing began with standard procedural language, introductions, legal context, and a review of the filed motions, but it was when the judge asked for opening remarks that things began to shift. Linda's attorney attempted to paint her as a longtime foster caregiver who had been unfairly targeted by a bitter, dependent daughter. He referenced her track record, her community involvement, and even tried to suggest that I had fabricated my claims in order to gain sympathy or financial benefit. But when it was my attorney's turn to respond, she did something I will never forget. She didn't argue, didn't posture, didn't speak over anyone. She simply stood, handed the judge a thick folder, and said, "Your Honor, the facts will speak for themselves." And they did. What followed was the kind of quiet devastation that can only happen when the truth is laid out in black and white, page after page of documented neglect, financial discrepancies, false reporting, and personal statements from school staff, medical professionals, and even the foster agency itself, all describing a pattern of emotional absence, misappropriation of funds, and an over-reliance on a non-guardian for the daily care and emotional well-being of 6 foster children. The judge asked pointed questions. Linda squirmed. Her lawyer tried to object, to redirect, to minimize, but there was nothing left to say when the paper trail was that thorough, and the kids, sitting quietly beside me, weren't crying, weren't fidgeting, weren't scared. They were simply watching. Listening. Waiting. And then the judge asked, in a voice that was firm but not unkind, whether anyone wished to make a personal statement before the ruling, and, before I could respond, the oldest child, who had barely spoken above a whisper for months, stood up, clutching the little drawing she'd made, and said, "She's not our mom. Erin is. She's the one who made us feel like people." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional in the way courtroom stories often are in movies. It was simple, honest, devastating in its truth. Linda finally broke, right there at the defendant's table, shaking her head and muttering about betrayal, and how none of this was fair, how I had poisoned them against her, how the system was broken, how she had done so much, and how we were all just ungrateful. And when the judge asked her calmly if she had receipts or any proof to contradict what had been presented, she couldn't produce a single document because, of course, she hadn't prepared for that. She had assumed her word would be enough. It wasn't. The judge ruled in favor of permanent guardianship being transferred to me. It wasn't an emotional announcement. There was no cheer, no applause, no dramatic banging of a gavel, just a statement entered into the record, a signature, and a legal confirmation of something we had all already known in our hearts for months. The courtroom emptied slowly, with Linda frozen in her seat, as if still trying to process the reality that she had lost everything she had built on pretense and greed, and we walked out together, myself and the kids, quiet but steady, like people leaving a long and painful chapter behind. She was outside when we stepped through the courthouse doors, sitting on the cold concrete steps, her makeup streaked, her eyes red, clutching her purse like it was the last piece of dignity she had left, and for a second, I thought she might say something. Might shout or beg or demand an explanation, but she didn't. She just sat there and sobbed, not for the children she claimed to love, not for the damage she had done, but for herself, for the loss of control, the humiliation, the finality of it all. And one by one, without instruction, without hesitation, those 6 kids walked right past her, each one holding my hand or my coat or my arm, not even sparing her a glance, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, because they knew, in the deepest part of themselves, that nothing she had said or done had ever really been about them. We got in the car. We drove away. And that was it. No screaming. No final showdown. Just 6 pairs of feet walking forward, together, toward a life that finally belonged to them, and to me, in every way that mattered.